Preface of the Life of Washington, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Washington, Volume 1 by John Marshall. Preface by the author. A desire to know intimately those illustrious personages who have performed a conspicuous part on the great theatre of the world is perhaps implanted in every human bosom. We delight to follow them through the various critical and perilous situations in which they have been placed, to view them in the extremes of adverse and prosperous fortune, to trace their progress through all the difficulties they have surmounted, and to contemplate their whole conduct at a time when the power and the pomp of office having disappeared, it may be presented to us in the simple garb of truth. If among those exalted characters which are produced in every age, none can have a fairer claim to the attention and recollection of mankind than those under whose auspices great empires have been founded, or political institutions deserving to be permanent, established. A faithful representation of the various important events connected with the life of the favorite son of America cannot be unworthy of the general regard. Among his own countrymen it will unquestionably excite the deepest interest. As if the chosen instrument of heaven, selected for the purpose of effecting the great designs of Providence respecting this our Western Hemisphere, it was the peculiar lot of this distinguished man, at every epoch when the destinies of his country seemed dependent on the measures adopted, to be called by the united voice of his fellow citizens to those high stations on which the success of those measures principally depended. It was his peculiar lot to be equally useful in obtaining the independence and consolidating the civil institutions of his country. We perceive him at the head of her armies during a most arduous and perilous war, on the events of which her national existence was staked, supporting with invincible fortitude the unequal conflict. That war being happily terminated, and the political revolutions of America requiring that he should once more relinquish his beloved retirement, we find him guiding her counsels with the same firmness, wisdom, and virtue which had long and successfully been displayed in the field. We behold him her chief magistrate at a time when her happiness, her liberty, perhaps her preservation, depended on so administering the affairs of the Union that a government standing entirely on the public favor, which had with infinite difficulty been adopted, and against which the most inveterate prejudices had been excited, should conciliate public opinion and acquire a firmness and stability that would enable it to resist the rude shocks it was destined to sustain. It was to his peculiar fortune to afford the brightest examples of moderation and patriotism by voluntarily divesting himself of the highest military and civil honors when the public interests no longer demanded that he should retain them. We find him retiring from the head of a victorious and discontented army which adored him so soon as the object for which arms had been taken up was accomplished, and withdrawing from the highest office an American citizen can hold, as soon as his influence, his character, and his talent ceased to be necessary to the maintenance of that government which had been established under his auspices. He was indeed first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his fellow citizens. A faithful detail of the transactions of a person so preeminently distinguished will be looked for with avidity, and the author laments his inability to present to the public a work which may gratify the expectations that have been raised. In addition to that just diffidence of himself which he very sincerely feels, two causes beyond his control combine to excite this apprehension. Accustomed to look in the page of history for incidents in themselves of great magnitude, to find immense exertions attended with inconsiderable effects, and vast means employed in producing unimportant ends, we are in the habit of bestowing on the recital of military actions a degree of consideration proportioned to the numbers engaged in them. When the struggle has terminated, and the agitations felt during its suspense have subsided, it is difficult to attach to enterprises in which small numbers have been concerned that admiration which is often merited by the talents displayed in their execution, or that interest which belongs to the consequences that have arisen from them. The long and distressing contest between Great Britain and these states did not abound in those great battles which are so frequent in the wars of Europe. Those who expect a continued succession of victories and defeats, who can only feel engaged in the movements of vast armies, and who believe that a hero must be perpetually in action, will be disappointed in almost every page of the following history. Seldom was the American chief in a condition to indulge his native courage in those brilliant achievements to which he was stimulated by his own feelings, and a detail of which interests, enraptures, and astonishes the reader. Had he not often checked his natural disposition, had he not tempered his ardor with caution, the war he conducted would probably have been of short duration, and the United States would still have been colonies. At the head of troops, most of whom were perpetually raw, because they were perpetually changing, who were neither well fed, paid, clothed, nor armed, and who were generally inferior, even in numbers, to the enemy, he derives no small title to glory from the consideration that he never despaired of the public safety, that he was able at all times to preserve the appearance of an army, and that in the most desperate situation of American affairs he did not for an instant cease to be formidable. To estimate rightly his worth, we must contemplate his difficulties. We must examine the means placed in his hands and the use he made of those means. To preserve an army when conquest was impossible, to avoid defeat and ruin when victory was unattainable, to keep his forces embodied and suppress the discontents of his soldiers, exasperated by a long course of the most cruel privations, to seize with unerring discrimination the critical moment when vigorous offensive operations might be advantageously carried on, are actions not less valuable in themselves, nor do they require less capacity in the chief who performs them, than a continued succession of battles. But they spread less splendor over the page which recounts them, and excite weaker emotions in the bosom of the reader. There is also another source from which some degree of disappointment has been anticipated. It is the impossibility of giving to the public in the first part of this work many facts not already in their possession. The American War was a subject of too much importance to have remained thus long unnoticed by the literary world. Almost every event worthy of attention which occurred during its progress has been gleaned up and detailed. Not only the public, but much of the private correspondence of the commander-in-chief has been inspected, and permission given to extract from it whatever might properly be communicated. In the military part of this history, therefore, the author can promise not much that is new. He can only engage for the correctness with which facts are stated, and for the diligence with which his researches have been made. The letters to and from the commander-in-chief during the war were very numerous and have been carefully preserved. The whole of this immensely voluminous correspondence has, with infinite labor, been examined, and the work now offered to the public is principally compiled from it. The facts which occurred on the continent are generally supported by these letters, and it has therefore been deemed unnecessary to multiply references to them. But there are many facts so connected with those events in which the general performed a principal part, that they ought not to be omitted, and respecting which his correspondence cannot be expected to furnish satisfactory information. Such facts have been taken from the histories of the day, and the authority relied on for the establishment of their verity has been cited. Dodsley's Annual Register, Belsham, Gordon, Ramsay, and Stedman have, for this purpose, been occasionally resorted to, and are quoted for all those facts which are detailed, in part, on their authority. Their very language has sometimes been employed without distinguishing the passages, especially when intermingled with others by marks of quotation, and the author persuades himself that this public declaration will rescue him from the imputation of receiving aids he is unwilling to acknowledge, or of wishing by a concealed plagiarism to usher to the world as his own the labors of others. In selecting the materials for the succeeding volumes, it was deemed proper to present to the public as much as possible of General Washington himself. Prominent as he must be in any history of the American War, there appeared to be a peculiar fitness in rendering him still more so in one which professes to give a particular account of his own life. His private opinions, therefore, his various plans, even those which were never carried into execution, his individual exertions to prevent and correct the multiplied errors committed by inexperience, are given in more minute detail, and more copious extracts from his letters are taken than would comport with the plan of a more general work. Many events, too, are unnoticed, which in such a composition would be worthy of being introduced, and much useful information has not been sought for, which a professed history of America ought to comprise. Yet the history of General Washington during his military command and civil administration is so much that of his country that the work appeared to the author to be most sensibly incomplete and unsatisfactory, while unaccompanied by such a narrative of the principal events preceding our Revolutionary War as would make the reader acquainted with the genius, character, and resources of the people about to engage in that memorable contest. This appeared the more necessary as that period of our history is but little known to ourselves. Several writers have detailed very minutely the affairs of a particular colony, but the Desideratum is a composition which shall present in one connected view the transactions of all those colonies which now form the United States. End of preface. Chapter 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 1, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Commission of Cabot, His Voyage to America, Views of Discovery relinquished by Henry VII, resumed by Elizabeth, Letters patent to Sir Humphrey Gilbert, His Voyages and Death, patent to Sir Walter Raleigh, Voyage of Sir Richard Grenville, colonists carried back to England by Drake, Grenville arrives with other colonists, they are left on Roanoke Island, are destroyed by the Indians, arrival of John White, he returns to England for succor, Raleigh assigns his patent, patent to Sir Thomas Gates and others, code of laws for the proposed colony drawn up by the King. The United States of America extend on the Atlantic from the Bay of Passamaquoddy in the 45th to Cape Florida in the 25th degree of north latitude, and thence on the Gulf of Mexico, including the small adjacent islands, to the mouth of the Sabine in the 17th degree of west longitude from Washington. From the mouth of the Sabine to the Rocky Mountains, they are separated from Spanish America by a line which pursues an irregular northwestern direction to the 42nd degree of north latitude, whence it proceeds west to the Pacific. On the north they are bounded by the British provinces, from which between the Lake of the Woods and the Rocky, or Stony Mountains, they are separated by the 49th parallel of north latitude. Their northern boundary, west of these mountains, has not yet been adjusted. The extent of this vast republic, in consequence of its recent acquisition of almost unexplored territory, has not yet been accurately ascertained, but may be stated at 2 millions of square miles. Its population, which began on the Atlantic and is traveling rapidly westward, amounted in 1820, according to the census of that year, to 9,654,415 persons. The enumerations which have been made under the authority of government show an augmentation of numbers at the rate of about 34 per centum in 10 years, and it is probable that for many years to come this ratio will not be materially changed. Public sentiment, to which the policy of the government conforms, is opposed to a large military establishment, and the distance of the United States from the great powers of the world protects them from the danger to which this policy might otherwise expose them. The Navy has become an object of great interest to the nation and may be expected to grow with its resources. In April 1816, Congress passed an act appropriating $1 million annually to its gradual increase and authorizing the construction of 9 ships to rate not less than 74 guns each and of 12 to rate not less than 44 guns each. The execution of this act is in rapid progress. Inconsiderable as the Navy now is with respect to the number and force of its ships, it is deemed inferior to none in existence for the bravery and skill of its officers and men. When we take into view the extensive sea coast of the United States, the magnificent lakes or inland seas which form a considerable part of their northern frontier, the abundance of their materials for shipbuilding, and the genius of their population for maritime enterprise, it is not easy to resist the conviction that this bulwark of defense will, at no very distant period, attain a size and strength sufficient to ensure the safety of the nation and the respect of the world. The net revenue of the United States amounted in the year 1822 to considerably more than $20 millions, and unless a course of legislation unfavorable to its augmentation be adopted, must grow with their population. In arts, in arms, and in power, they have advanced and are advancing with unexampled rapidity. The history of their progress, from the first feeble settlements made by Europeans on a savage coast to the present state of greatness, while it has just claims to the attention of the curious of all nations, may be expected deeply to interest every American. Soon after the return of Columbus from that memorable voyage which opened the vast regions of the West to civilized man, the maritime states of Europe manifested a desire to share with Spain the glory, the wealth, and the dominion to be acquired in the New World. By no one of these states was this desire carried into action more promptly than by England. Henry VII had received communications from Columbus during the tedious and uncertain negotiations of that great man at the dilatory court of Ferdinand, which prepared him for the important discoveries afterwards made and inclined him to countenance the propositions of his own subjects for engaging in similar adventures. Commission of Cabot on the 5th of March, 1495. He granted a commission to John Cabot, an enterprising Venetian who had settled in Bristol, and to his 3 sons, Louis, Sebastian, and Sanctius, empowering them or either of them to sail under the banner of England towards the east, north, or west, in order to discover countries unoccupied by any Christian state and to take possession of them in his name. His voyage to America. It does not appear that the expedition contemplated at the date of this commission was prosecuted immediately, but in May, 1496, Cabot, with his 2nd son, Sebastian, sailed from Bristol in a small squadron consisting of 1 ship furnished by the king and 4 barks fitted out by merchants of that city, and steering almost due west, discovered the islands of Newfoundland and St. John's, and soon afterward reached the continent of North America, along which he sailed from the 56th to the 38th degree of north latitude, in the vain hope of discovering a passage into the Pacific. Thus, according to the English historians, was first discovered that immense continent which stretches from the Gulf of Mexico as far north as has yet been explored, and to this voyage the English trace their title to the country they afterwards acquired by settlement and by arms. France, which has since contested with Britain the possession of a considerable portion of this important territory, has also advanced claims to its discovery, but they seem not to be well founded. The scheme of making settlements relinquished. The ardor which had been excited in the bosom of Henry for making acquisitions in the New World expired with his first effort. Cabot, on his return, found that monarch entirely disinclined to the farther prosecution of a scheme in which he had engaged with some zeal, the commencement of which had been attended with encouraging appearances. Several causes are supposed to have contributed to suspend the pursuits of the English in America. Previous to its discovery, the Portuguese had explored the Azores, or Western Islands, in consequence of which they claimed this continent, and contended for the exclusion of the Spaniards from the Western Ocean. The controversy was decided by the Pope, who on the 7th of May, 1493, of his own mere liberality and certain knowledge, and the plenitude of apostolic authority, granted to Spain the countries discovered or to be discovered by her to the westward of a line to be drawn from pole to pole 100 leagues west of the Azores, excepting such countries as might be in the possession of any other Christian prince antecedent to the year 1493, and to Portugal her discoveries eastward of that line. The validity of this grant was probably strengthened, in the opinion of Henry, by other circumstances. He set a high value on the friendship of the King of Spain, with whom he was then negotiating the marriage which afterwards took place between his eldest son and Catherine, the daughter of that monarch. Ferdinand was jealous to excess of all his rights, and Henry was not inclined to interrupt the harmony subsisting between the two crowns by asserting claims to the country discovered by Cabot, which was obviously within the limits to which the pretensions of Spain extended. Renewed by Elizabeth, the fisheries of Newfoundland were carried on by individuals to a considerable extent, and a paltry traffic was continued with the natives, but no serious design of acquiring territory and planting colonies in America was formed until the reign of Elizabeth, when a plan for making permanent settlements was proposed and patronized by several persons of rank and influence. To select a man qualified for this arduous task and disposed to engage in it was among the first objects to which their attention was directed. Sir Humphrey Gilbert had rendered himself conspicuous by his military services and by a treatise concerning the Northwest Passage, in which great ingenuity and learning are stated by Dr. Robertson to be mingled with the enthusiasm, the credulity, and sanguine expectation which incite men to new and hazardous undertakings. On this gentleman the adventurers turned their eyes, and he was placed at the head of the enterprise. On the 11th of June, 1578, he obtained letters patent from the Queen, vesting in him the powers that were required, on receiving which he, with the associates of his voyage, embarked for America. But his success did not equal his expectations. The various difficulties inseparable from the settlement of a distant, unexplored country, inhabited only by savages, the inadequacy of the supplies which could be furnished for a colony by the funds of a few private individuals, the misfortune of having approached the continent too far towards the north, where the cold, barren coast of Cape Breton was rather calculated to repel than invite a settlement, have been assigned as the probable causes of his failure. 2 expeditions conducted by this gentleman ended disastrously. In the last he himself perished, having done nothing farther in the execution of his patent than taking possession of the island of Newfoundland in the name of Elizabeth. Sir Walter Raleigh, alike distinguished by his genius, his courage, and the severity of his fate, had been deeply interested in the adventures in which his half-brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, had wasted his fortune, and was not deterred by their failure or by the difficulties attending such an enterprise from prosecuting with vigor a plan so well calculated to captivate his bold and romantic temper. 1584. Patent to Sir Walter Raleigh. On the 26th of March he obtained a patent from the Queen, and on the 27th of April dispatched 2 small vessels under the command of Captains Amadis and Barlow for the purpose of visiting the country and of acquiring some previous knowledge of those circumstances which might be essential to the welfare of the colony he was about to plant. To avoid the error of Gilbert in holding too far north, Amadis and Barlow took the route by the Canaries and the West India Islands and approached the North American continent towards the Gulf of Florida. On the 2nd of July they touched at a small island situate on the inlet into Pamlico Sound, whence they proceeded to Roanoke near the mouth of Albemarle Sound. After employing a few weeks in traffic with the Indians, from whom they collected some confused accounts respecting the neighboring continent, they took with them 2 of the natives, who willingly accompanied them, and embarked for England, where they arrived on the 15th of September. The splendid description which they gave of the soil, the climate, and the productions of the country they had visited so pleased Elizabeth that she bestowed on it the name of Virginia, as a memorial that it had been discovered during the reign of a virgin queen. Raleigh, encouraged by their report to hasten his preparations for taking possession of the property, fitted out a squadron consisting of 7 small ships laden with arms, ammunition, provisions, and passengers. 1585. Voyage of Sir Richard Grenville, which sailed from Plymouth on the 9th of April under the command of Sir Richard Grenville who was his relation and interested with him in the patent. Having taken the southern route and wasted some time in cruising against the Spaniards, Sir Richard did not reach the coasts of North America until the close of the month of June. He touched at both the islands on which Amadas and Barlow had landed, and made some excursions into different parts of the continent around Pamlico and Albemarle Sounds. First colony. Having established a colony consisting of 108 persons in the island of Roanoke, an incommodious station, without any safe harbor, he committed the government of it to Mr. Ralph Lane, and on the 25th of August sailed for England. An insatiate passion for gold, attended by an eager desire to find it in the bowels of the earth, for a long time the disease of Europeans in America became the scourge of this feeble settlement. The English flattered themselves that the country they had discovered could not be destitute of those mines of the precious metals with which Spanish America abounded. The most diligent researches were made in quest of them, and the infatuating hope of finding them stimulated the colonists to the utmost exertions of which they were capable. The Indians soon discerned the object for which they searched with so much avidity, and amused them with tales of rich mines in countries they had not yet explored. Seduced by this information, they encountered incredible hardships, and in this vain search wasted that time which ought to have been employed in providing the means of future subsistence. Mutual suspicion and disgust between them and the natives ripened into open hostility, and the provisions brought from England being exhausted, they were under the necessity of resorting for food to the precarious supplies which could be drawn from the rivers and woods. 1586. In this state of distress they were found in June by Sir Francis Drake, who was then returning from a successful expedition against the Spaniards in the West Indies. He agreed to supply them with about 100 men, 4 months' provisions, and a small vessel, but before she could be brought into a place of security and the men and stores disembarked, she was driven out to sea by a sudden and violent storm. Colonists are carried back to England by Drake. Discouraged by this misfortune and worn out with fatigue and famine, the colonists unanimously determined to abandon the colony and were at their own request taken on board the fleet which sailed for England. Thus terminated the first English colony planted in America. The only acquisition made by this expensive experiment was a better knowledge of the country and its inhabitants. Grenville plants a second colony. A few days after the departure of Drake with Lane and his associates, a small vessel which had been dispatched by Raleigh with a supply of provisions reached its place of destination. Not finding the colonists, this vessel returned to England. Soon after its departure, Sir Richard Grenville arrived with 3 ships and ample supplies. Having searched in vain for the colonists he had left, and being unable to conjecture their fate, he placed 15 men in the island with provisions for 2 years, for the purpose of retaining possession of the country, and returned to England. Destroyed by the Indians, this small party was soon destroyed by the Indians. 1587. Not discouraged by the ill success which had thus far attended his efforts to make a settlement in America, Raleigh in the following year fitted out 3 ships under the command of Captain John White, and it is said directed the colony to be removed to the waters of the Chesapeake, which bay had been discovered by Lane in the preceding year. Instructed by calamity, he adopted more efficacious means for preserving and continuing the colony than had before been used. The number of men was greater, they were accompanied by some women, and their supply of provisions was more abundant. Mr. White was appointed their governor. 12 assistants were assigned him as a council, and a charter incorporating them by the name of the governor and assistants of the city of Raleigh in Virginia was granted them. Third colony arrives. Thus prepared for a permanent settlement, they arrived in July at Roanoke, where they received the melancholy intelligence of the loss of their countrymen who had been left there by Sir Richard Grenville. They determined, however, to remain at the same place, and began to make the necessary preparations for their accommodation. Aware of the danger to be apprehended from the hostile disposition of their neighbors, they endeavored to effect a reconciliation with the natives, one of whom, who had accompanied Amadas and Barlow to England, and who was distinguished by his unshaken attachment to the English, was christened and styled Lord of Dassa Montpeak, an Indian nation in the neighborhood. About the same time, the first child of English parentage was born in America. She was the daughter of Ananias Dare, and after the place of her birth was named Virginia. Soon perceiving their want of many things essential to the preservation and comfortable subsistence of a new settlement, the colonists with one voice deputed their governor to solicit those specific aids which their situation particularly and essentially required. On his arrival in England, he found the whole nation alarmed at the formidable preparations for their invasion made by Philip II of Spain, and Raleigh, Grenville, and the other patrons of the colony ardently engaged in those measures of defense which the public danger demanded. Mingling, however, with his exertions to defend his native country some attention to the colony he had planted, Raleigh found leisure to fit out a small fleet for its relief, the command of which was given to Sir Richard Grenville. But the apprehensions from the Spanish armament still increasing, the ships of force prepared by Raleigh were detained in port by order of the Queen, and Sir Richard Grenville was commanded not to leave Cornwall, where his services were deemed necessary. 1588, on the 22nd of April, White put to sea with two small barks, but instead of hastening to the relief of his distressed countrymen, wasted his time in cruising, and being beaten by a superior force, was totally disabled from prosecuting his voyage. 1589, Raleigh assigns his patent. The attention of Raleigh being directed to other more splendid objects, he assigned his patent to Sir Thomas Smith and a company of merchants in London. 1590, after this transfer, a year was permitted to elapse before any effort was made for the relief of the colony. In March, 3 ships fitted out by the company, in one of which Mr. White embarked, sailed from Plymouth, but having cruelly and criminally wasted their time in plundering the Spaniards in the West Indies, they did not reach Hatteras until the month of August. Third colony lost. They fired a gun to give notice of their arrival and sent a party to the place where the colony had been left, but no vestige of their countrymen could be found. In attempting the next day to go to Roanoke, one of the boats in passing a bar was half filled with water, another was overset, and 6 men were drowned. 2 other boats were fitted out with 19 men to search the island thoroughly on which the colony had been left. At the departure of Mr. White, it was in contemplation to remove about 50 miles into the country, and it had been agreed that, should the colonists leave the island, they would carve the name of the place to which they should remove on some tree, door, or post, with the addition of a cross over it as a signal of distress, if they should be really distressed at the time of changing their situation. After considerable search, the word Croatan was found carved in fair capital letters on one of the chief posts, but unaccompanied by the sign of distress which had been agreed on. Croatan was the name of an Indian town on the north side of Cape Lookout, and for that place the fleet weighed anchor the next day. Meeting with a storm and several accidents, they were discouraged from proceeding on their voyage, and determining to suspend their search, returned to the West Indies. The company made no farther attempt to find these lost colonists, nor has the time or the manner of their perishing ever been discovered. 1602, Voyage of Gosnold. The subsequent voyages made by the English to North America were for the sole purpose of traffic, and were unimportant in their consequences until the year 1602, when one was undertaken by Bartholomew Gosnold, which contributed greatly to the revival of the then dormant spirit of colonizing in the New World. He sailed from Falmouth in a small bark with 32 men, and steering nearly west, reached the American continent on the 11th of May in about 43 degrees of north latitude. Finding no good harbor at this place, Gosnold put to sea again and stood southward. The next morning he descried a promontory which he called Cape Cod, and holding his course along the coast as it stretched to the southwest, touched at 2 islands, the first of which he named Martha's Vineyard, and the second Elizabeth's Island. Having passed some time at these places, examining the country and trading with the natives, he returned to England. This voyage was completed in less than 4 months, and was attended with important consequences. Gosnold had found a healthy climate, a rich soil, good harbors, and a route which shortened considerably the distance to the continent of North America. He had seen many of the fruits known and prized in Europe blooming in the woods, and had planted European grain which grew rapidly. Encouraged by this experiment and delighted with the country, he formed the resolution of transporting thither a colony and of procuring the cooperation of others by whom his plan might be supported. So unfortunate, however, had been former attempts of this sort, that men of wealth and rank, though strongly impressed by his report of the country, were slow in giving full faith to his representations and in entering completely into his views. One vessel was fitted out by the merchants of Bristol, and another by the Earl of Southampton and Lord Arundel of Wardour, in order to learn whether Gosnold's account of the country was to be considered as a just representation of its state, or as the exaggerated description of a person fond of magnifying his own discoveries. Both returned with a full confirmation of his veracity and with the addition of so many new circumstances in favor of the country as greatly increased the desire of settling it. Richard Hakluyt, prebendary of Westminster, a man of distinguished learning and intelligence, contributed more than any other by his judicious exertions to form an association sufficiently extensive, powerful, and wealthy to execute the often renewed and often disappointed project of establishing colonies in America. At length such an association was formed, and a petition was presented to James I, who had succeeded to the crown of England, praying the royal sanction to the plan which was proposed. That pacific monarch was delighted with it, and immediately acceded to the wishes of its projectors. Patent to Sir Thomas Gates and others. On the 10th of April, letters patent were issued under the Great Seal of England to the petitioners, Sir Thomas Gates and his associates, granting to them those territories in America lying on the sea coast between the 34th and 45th degrees of north latitude, and which either belonged to that monarch or were not then possessed by any other Christian prince or people, and also the islands adjacent thereto, or within 100 miles thereof. They were divided at their own desire into two companies, one consisting of certain knights, gentlemen, merchants, and other adventurers of the city of London and elsewhere, was called the first colony, and was required to settle between the 34th and 41st degrees of north latitude. The other, consisting of certain knights, gentlemen, merchants, and other adventurers of Bristol, Exeter, Plymouth, and elsewhere, was named the second colony, and was ordered to settle between the 38th and 45th degrees of north latitude, yet so that the colony last formed should not be planted with 100 miles of the prior establishment. The adventurers were empowered to transport so many English subjects as should be willing to accompany them, who with their descendants were at all times to enjoy the same liberties within any other dominions of the crown of England as if they had remained or were born within the realm. A council consisting of 13 to be appointed and removed at the pleasure of the crown was established for each colony, to govern it according to such laws as should be given under the sign, manual, and privy seal of England. 2 other boards, to consist also of 13 persons each, and to be appointed by the king, were invested with the superior direction of the affairs of the colonies. The adventurers were allowed to search for and open mines of gold, silver, and copper, yielding 1/5 of the 2 former metals and 1/15 of the last to the king, and to make a coin which should be current both among the colonists and natives. The president and council were authorized to repel those who should, without their authority, attempt to settle or trade within their jurisdiction, and to seize and detain the persons and effects of such intruders until they should pay a duty of 2 1/2 per centum ad valorem, if subjects, but of 5 per centum if aliens. These taxes were to be applied for 21 years to the use of the adventurers, and were afterwards to be paid into the royal exchequer. Code of laws for the colony drawn up by the king. While the council for the patentees were employed in making preparations to secure the benefits of their grant, James was assiduously engaged in the new and to his vanity the flattering task of framing a code of laws for the government of the colonies about to be planted. Having at length prepared this code, he issued it under the sign, manual, and privy seal of England. By these regulations he vested the general superintendence of the colonies in a council in England, composed of a few persons of consideration and talents. The Church of England was established. The legislative and executive powers within the colonies were vested in the president and councils, but their ordinances were not to touch life or member, were to continue in force only until made void by the king or his council in England for Virginia, and were to be in substance consonant to the laws of England. They were enjoined to permit none to withdraw the people from their allegiance to himself and his successors, and to cause all persons so offending to be apprehended and imprisoned until reformation, or in cases highly offensive to be sent to England to receive punishment. No person was to be permitted to remain in the colony without taking the oath of obedience. Tumults, mutiny, and rebellion, murder, and incest were to be punished with death, and for these offenses the criminal was to be tried by a jury. Inferior crimes were to be punished in a summary way at the discretion of the president and council. Lands were to be holden within the colony as the same estates enjoyed in England. Kindness towards the heathen was enjoined, and a power reserved to the king and his successors to ordain farther laws so that they were consonant to the jurisprudence of England. Under this charter and these laws, which manifest at the same time a total disregard of all political liberty and a total ignorance of the real advantages which a parent state may derive from its colonies, which vest the higher powers of legislation in persons residing out of the country, not chosen by the people, nor affected by the laws they make, and yet leave commerce unrestrained? The patentees proceeded to execute the arduous and almost untried task of peopling a strange, distant, and uncultivated land, covered with woods and marshes, and inhabited only by savages easily irritated, and when irritated more fierce than the beasts they hunted. Chapter 2.